He weaves experiences from his life and those of others to show stark lessons to audiences. He's also a skilled facilitator, guiding groups into creative and inclusive ways to develop solutions and to grasp opportunities. And just to say is that we're going to be recording this part of the session, just Ed's talk, and then during the workshop, we'll stop the recording again so that you can feel free to participate. So without further ado, let me invite Ed. Ed, the platform is yours.
It's been a very tough time, hasn't it? It's been a year of learning immense lessons, of trying to find ways of doing things that we never thought we would have to do. And in fact, the first half of 2021, so far almost feels like Q5 of 2020. And yeah, I guess it is. So we've been through this very, very difficult period that we couldn't have imagined before. Nobody could have imagined that this would happen. And yet here we are. So we found ways to survive this terribly difficult period quite successfully, surprisingly enough. And there were some losses, but there were a surprising number of businesses and organizations that thrived. And there were, of course, the loss of life, of people who were disabled or who lost their lives during this. And that is the most serious and horrific experience. Now, I had a bad experience, nothing like losing a loved one. But in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdown, I had something really bad happening to me. It was just an ordinary Tuesday morning, and I was sipping my breakfast coffee, and I picked up my phone to read my messages, and I couldn't see them. The text was just a blur, and I panicked. And I picked up a book I'd been reading, and I couldn't see that either. I couldn't read it. And I realized with absolute horror that the degenerative eye disease I have had stolen the last of my vision. It had taken away everything that I had in terms of reading. And then the realization started to come in one after the other. That meant that I couldn't drive. What was I going to do about my work? I needed to use my computer. I needed to read text. I needed to read documents, and I couldn't read. And I realized with horror that I couldn't drive either, if that were the case. And I've driven for a couple of million kilometers probably. I love driving. And I realized with great sadness that the last time I'd driven my beautiful Alfa sports car was the last time I would ever drive a car. It was a horrifying realization. And then the thought of books struck me. Now, I've been an avid reader since I was 6 years old, and that's a long, long time ago. And the thought of not picking up a book and getting absorbed in the contents or learning or being entertained or enthralled, I just couldn't handle it. And I rushed to my computer, and I had difficulty even seeing the keyboard. So suddenly everything changed, and it wasn't the ideal time because I couldn't rush out and cry on someone's shoulder, because we weren't allowed to rush out and cry on shoulders or for any other purpose. And so I had to find ways of dealing with this terrible crisis in my life. And it was as if a wall had been built across the road in front of me, and I couldn't go over it, and I couldn't go around it or underneath it. And there was big temptation to just sit against the wall and curl up in a ball and feel sorry for yourself. And there were moments of this, but that's not my style. So I reached out and I started looking for what I could do. The first issues that I needed were light and magnification, because if the text was very large, then I could read it. And if it was very well lit and very large, then I could read it with reasonable ease. So I set out looking for a magnifier. And I looked at all sorts of optical and electronic magnifiers, things of absolute wonder, and things of absolute wonder prices as well. And I found a very simple one, which is a part of Windows in the accessibility suite. So I thought, pounced on that, and I thought, yeah, here's a magnifier which will magnify what's on my screen. So I quickly installed it, activated it, and then I didn't know how to work it. So I thought, well, that's okay. I'll just go to the help screen. But I couldn't read the help screen. So here was I with a hand lens leaning into the screen, trying to read the help screen of Microsoft. And as you know, Microsoft Help is very helpful. It tells you everything perfectly correctly, excepting what you need to know. But I've figured it out, and I've used it since, and it's on my system right now. I use it routinely. And then my head torch became my best friend because I could carry light anywhere. And I needed to now work on a computer. So I reached out to some colleagues, and I was amazed what I found. I was amazed at the people who were blind or uh, visually impaired and what they were doing. One is totally blind, and he's part of a group that runs scuba diving tours for blind people and paraplegics and deaf people and visually impaired people, and they go scuba diving quite often. The fact that he's blind doesn't seem to worry him unduly. Another is a tour guide and travel blogger who leads parties, or used to before the lockdown, all over Europe. A third runs one of the biggest NGOs in Johannesburg. And they gave me all the advice and got all the technology. So I found the text-to-speech readers on my phone and my computer. So now I get talked back not only by my other half, but also by my computer and my phone. And I could start functioning. It still took me a long time. It could take me a day to compose a page of text. It could take me an hour and a half to type a WhatsApp message correctly. But I persevered, and I found amazing networks of people who were there to help. And I joined some of them. One was about reading, well, now audiobooks, of course. And another was about technology for blind and partly sighted people. And they were so willing to give. And I learned my first real lesson. And the first real lesson was that I had been wasting my time on networking for years. And I'm an enthusiastic networker. I've even spoken on networking at public forums. I thought that I was really good and efficient at networking. But now I found these networks where it was all give, 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 not take, take, take. And I realized I'd been spinning my wheels because I was going into network where everybody wanted something. They wanted to sell, or they wanted to persuade you to do things. They didn't want to listen to you. And here were these networks that wanted nothing other than to listen to me and solve my problems. So I learned a big life lesson now. Now I was fairly well geared up. I could use my computer. I got a lovely high visibility keyboard with big yellow and black keys on it. So I could more or less read my keyboard, and I was all set. But I needed to build up my business, which had failed, not failed, but had been badly damaged by the lockdown and everything else. So I started building up my business, and I looked around and thought, easiest way is digital marketing. So I went all out on digital marketing, and I attended webinars, and I read books, and I updated all sorts of things. And I tried to push. There were 2 Facebook pages and a WhatsApp, a YouTube channel, and Twitter, and a LinkedIn site, and a whole lot, and a blog, and a whole lot of other things. And I just got very frustrated. I ran out of time. I was too slow to work these things effectively, and I got very, very frustrated. And then, funnily enough, I taught myself a lesson, because in the middle of all of this, I was asked to do a speech on the fact that digital marketing would never be the same again. And so I prepared a speech, and I told in the speech the story of a young digital marketer by the name of Thandi. And Thandi, in my story, had started to work for a company that made emergency vehicles, fire trucks and ambulances and so on. And she'd gone in and she'd become an instant hero, because a very conservative industry there. And she'd sorted out their website and their social media and run campaigns, and their brand blossomed, and their leads came in, and everyone loved Thandi. And she got very adventurous. She developed some beautiful videos for YouTube of fighting fires and ambulances in operation. And she even experimented with virtual reality. But as time went on, Thandi was working harder and harder and getting less and less. She was starting to get the diminishing returns kind of issue. And she grew frustrated, because every competitor was now doing exactly the same as she was. And thinking about even leaving, she decided, heck with it, she would go off to the gym and work out. So she went to the gym and she pounded the treadmill. And after a while, she looked down at the instruments and saw that she'd run for more than 10 kilometers at a very good speed. And she was very happy with herself and smiled and looked out the window and saw the same scene that she had seen when she got onto the treadmill. And suddenly a light bulb went off in Thandi's head. She saw that as a metaphor for her own life. She was trying to jump on every bandwagon, follow every trend, do everything that everybody else was doing, and she was going nowhere. And while I was creating the story for this speech, another light bulb went off, this time in my head. And I said, I'm not talking about Thandi, I'm talking about Ed. I am doing exactly that. I'm trying to follow every trend. I'm trying to do the wrong things. So between the mythical Thandi and myself, we devised a couple of strategies. And the first strategy we called the eye of an eagle and the reaction of a leopard. So the eye of an eagle would be to look far ahead, to look at areas that you wouldn't otherwise see, that others didn't see. So in Thandi's case, she looked way ahead and started mapping out weather patterns 3, 4, 5 years ahead. And so she could forecast where there would be droughts and floods and fires and other requirements for emergency vehicles, and building her brand in those areas. And then she developed the reaction time of a leopard. And so she watched not the trends in marketing. She had given up jumping from one bandwagon to the next better, bigger bandwagon. She started to look at the trends in her market. And as soon as she saw something that changed or something that gave her cause, she leapt on it like a leopard, and instant reaction. And I did the same. I started looking far ahead in the middle of last year. and saying, what's going to happen in the future? And I did my research and I looked at a whole lot of stuff, and I realized somewhere around about the first or second quarter of 2021, things will not have changed a lot. So there's going to be a lot of entrepreneurs looking for solutions, new and creative solutions. And guess what? Blindingly obvious, isn't it? So that's why I'm here today. And I also stopped doing the trend thing as well. Now, just as a little aside, I was looking for more information on microphones because I had to change my whole way of working from being on a stage to being behind a Zoom screen. And I was looking for information on microphones use. And so I looked for books, and I stopped counting when there were 43. I think there were 150 books online on microphone use. Too much information. So I quit. I decided, sorry, was there a question there? No? Okay. So I quit the business of following trends, and I looked at market trends, and I looked at what was coming down the line, and I urge you to do the same thing. There's easy ways to do it. You should be talking to the futurists. You should be talking to the industry gurus. You need to develop those eyes of an eagle and reaction time of a leopard. The second fundamental lesson that I learned, which I called myopia, was that most businesses sit in a very tight comfort zone. They know what's around them, and they handle it well, and they think they see the future, but most of them don't. Let me give you an illustration. When the coronavirus went from Wuhan in China to Italy, we could see that this had devastated the industrial north of Italy. We saw what was happening, the lockdowns, the closure of all businesses, and we all looked in awe at this. Did we react as well as we should? Perhaps. Did we really train all our staff to work remotely? Did we work on having a new way of operating and secure our suppliers and secure our customers? Probably not as well as we should have. So we could have seen that. We were just a bit short-sighted. And it's very easy in business to be myopic, short-sighted, because that's our comfort zone, and we love comfort zones. And you know, this one is probably best expressed by a story which was told by Napoleon Hill in that iconic book, Think and Grow Rich. Old book now, but still a good one. And he told of the prospector in Colorado who had staked his claim and dug his mine, and finally he'd mined a bit of gold, but he couldn't make it work, and finally he quit. And he sold his mining machinery to the local junk man, because that's the only person who would buy it, and he left the gold fields tail between the legs. And the junk man, being astute, looked at this claim and said, that's maybe worth a bit of investment. So he hired a mining geologist, and the mining geologist confirmed that there was gold on that claim. So the junk man stopped being a junk man and started digging and became a miner and started continuing the adit that the miner had dug. And he dug a further 3 feet, and he hit the richest gold seam in the Colorado goldfields. The previous miner had stopped 3 feet from incredible riches. Don't stop 3 feet from your riches. Don't be short-sighted. There's another amusing mining story, and that concerns a farm of one Johan Minnar He was farmed just east of Pretoria in the late 1800s. And there was a lot of mining activity around in that area at the time. So there were a lot of prospectors around who wanted to check his farm to see whether there were minerals on it. And he hated mining and he hated prospectors, and he wasn't partial to English prospectors, rightly so, as it turned out. So any Englishman who arrived wanting to survey his farm got chased off with a shotgun. But two very canny guys thought that they knew there was something on that farm. They were sure of it, but they had to prove it. So they presented themselves as veterinary experts. And they arrived and they told Minnaar that there was an epidemic of a particularly nasty cattle disease. And if it got into his farm, if it infected his cattle, he would lose his entire herd. And they needed to check his herd to find if there were any infections. So they strode around the farm for an entire day looking for likely mining sites. And they found a very likely site. So they shot the nearest cow. And they told Minnaar that that cow was the only one had been infected, but it should be buried very deep. So a gang of Minnaar's laborers dug this huge pit, which was actually just a prospector's well. And while this was happening, the two prospectors discreetly took samples of all the soil that came out, and then they chucked the cow in the hole and closed it up. And nothing would happen because Minnaar wouldn't sell. But his dislike of English people turned out to be right, because the Anglo-Boer War came on shortly thereafter. He and his family were interned. His farm was burnt, his crops destroyed, his cattle driven off. And he came out after the war with nothing and no compensation. And he tried valiantly to farm, but he couldn't do it. So sadly, he sold his farm to a mining concern. The mining concern put a mine almost at the spot where the long dead cow was buried. And they dug into it, and only 3 years later, the mine's supervisor, I think his name was Stevenson, was only 5 meters underground on a stope when he noticed an odd bit of rock, and he dug out the odd bit of rock. And he looked at it and he thought, I can't believe this. He washed it in a bit of water and he went rushing up to the head office. And the story is told that he got into the head office on the mine, and the financial director, who wasn't a mining man, was the first person he encountered. And the financial director said, why aren't you at your station? You're supposed to be working. And Stevenson said, look what I found. And the financial director looked at it and said, that's a lump of rock, and threw it out the window. It wasn't a lump of rock. It was a diamond. The famous Cullinan diamond, 3,000 carats, the biggest diamond ever mined by a very long way. So those two prospectors had eyes on the future. They were not myopic. And there are good ways to do this. You could look at things like Google Trends. You can look at what's happening in your industry. Again, you can talk to futurists. There's all sorts of ways of handling it. My last lesson I've called zone out, and that is moving out of your comfort zone. Because we're really good at being in our comfort zone, and often we think we can move out of our comfort zone quite easily. It's actually quite difficult to do. I have experience of this. So I know how difficult it is to move out of your comfort zone, because I had to. I had to redo everything I knew into some different format. But it really is pretty difficult to do. And everyone says, get out of your comfort zone. But how do you know you're out of your comfort zone? Well, I can give you some symptoms. You get a lot of sweaty hands. You probably throw the odd quiet or noisy temper tantrum. I know I do. You might learn to swear very creatively. Those are the sort of symptoms which show that you're not comfortable where you are. You find creative ways of not doing things. So I went through all of those. And I came across a beautiful little children's story called The Gruffalo. Some people might know The Gruffalo. Beautiful little children's story. And it related to what I'd been thinking about. And what I'd been thinking about is that during the lockdown, all of us hid behind big walls. We had to. We were timid because it wasn't a time to be adventurous. You couldn't be. You wanted to hold on to everything you had. But you know, timidity is a habit, and it's very difficult to stop being timid suddenly and let down the drawbridge and pull up the portcullis and sally forth and slay dragons. It's not easy to do. So this story of the Gruffalo might enhance your life. So this was the story of a little timid mouse who decided he wasn't going to be timid anymore. He was going to stride through the forest unafraid of all the predators. So he strode through the forest, and of course all the predators pounced on this little mouse. But the little mouse had invented this terrible beast called a Gruffalo, pure figment of his imagination. And the Gruffalo was this terrible beast with terrible teeth and terrible jaws and all sorts of other things. It's a lovely little delightful story for children. And so he met a fox, and he told the fox that he was on his way to take tea with the Gruffalo. And he mentioned that the Gruffalo's favorite food was fried fox. So the fox thought, better not mess with this mouse. And similar thing happened when the snake arrived to eat this mouse, and he described the Gruffalo as having a particularly fondness for scrambled snake. And the snake left him alone, and then the owl left him alone. So the mouse strode bravely through the forest. Now, of course, there is a twist in the tale. There's quite a nice twist in the tale, because the mouse had been lying. The Gruffalo, of course, didn't exist. And that's not a good foundation for sallying forth to slay dragons. So what actually happened is the mouse encountered a real Gruffalo, the actual thing of his imagination. And the Gruffalo was quite keen on eating the mouse as well. Now, I'm not going to spoil the end for you because it's a gorgeous little story. But it being a child's story, believe me, this mouse was very resourceful, and all ended well for the mouse. So think of the mouse next time you think of being timid. Time to go out and be adventurous and grow. The last story is perhaps a little more stark. And this consists of a phone call that I got. And a lot of you people will know that I'm a counselor on a crisis line. And I got a call from a gentleman who had lost it all. He was at the end of his tether. He told a familiar story. He'd been wealthy, successful, professional, had a beautiful family and a beautiful house and wonderful cars and successful children, and he was an alcoholic. And he finally let the alcohol get to him. And so he went downhill, lost his job and went downhill in a succession of jobs. And then he lost his house and he lost his cars, and his family were disgusted with him. They wanted nothing to do with him. And finally, he lost his self-respect and became nothing more than a tramp who moved from town to town begging. And he was then living in terrible circumstances in a broken down shanty on the edge of a very large informal settlement in a country town far from here. And he told me that life was not worth winning, not worth living. He was going to end it all. He just had nothing. He had no self-respect. His family hated him. He had no prospects of ever finding employment. And he was sick of starving and being uncomfortable and hating himself. So he was going to end it all. And somewhere in the middle of the discussion, I said to him, tell me about a time when you were happy and fulfilled and felt good about yourself, expecting to hear about his corporate experience. And instead he said, tomatoes. Tomatoes? I thought to myself, how incongruous is that at this time? And he explained that his hobby was growing these champion tomatoes, and he could grow these big, juicy red tomatoes that when you taste one, every tomato you buy from the store tastes like nothing by comparison. And it was just so incongruous that there was a moment of silence between us. And then he said with wonder in his voice, why am I not growing tomatoes? I have starving people all around here. I could be feeding them. And he said, I am going to grow tomatoes and feed people. Now, I'll forever be indebted to that gentleman for teaching 3 fundamental lessons. The first lesson that he taught me was that you always reach out. It doesn't matter how bad things are. There's someone waiting to listen to you. The second lesson was don't quit. However bad the circumstances are, there may be a way around it if you look hard enough. And the third and the most important lesson of all 3 was that you will not find your solution by looking at the elephant in the room. In his case, his terrible circumstances and descent from a very nice position into a disastrous position. And once he looked around that and he looked at his successes and what he had achieved and what his skill set were, he could find the answer to that he needed. Now that's been a life lesson to me. And I hope, especially at this time, that it can become a life lesson to you, so that you won't find your solutions to your problems by looking at the big elephant in the room, the economy and political uncertainty and the unemployment rate and the lockdown and perhaps future lockdowns and the hesitancy of all businesses to do any kind of business and all of these other things. You will find or may find your solution by not looking at the elephant in the room, which is quite difficult to do, but worthwhile. So there you have them, 3 life lessons that I had to learn and could only have learned because I lost my sight. And they're yours to use for free, and you don't even have to go blind. So trendy, follow the right trends. Myopic, don't be too short-sighted. Look ahead at what's coming down the track. And zone out. Get really out of your comfort zone, out of where you used to. You might find a wonderful future. I hope those work for you as time goes on.
Oh, thank you, Ed. So much there to further discuss and just to digest and maybe clarify. So I really want to invite everyone present. If you've got a question or you have a comment to make, you either unmute yourself and ask Ed, direct a question to Ed, or type it in the chat box, whatever it entails. This is the part where we've heard, but we need to internalize. And just to come back to what I've heard, Ed, yet the last three things is you always reach out. What tends to happen when we are stressed out, when pressure is so much that we become so overwhelmed, we tend to isolate ourselves. So it's not just about compartmentalization, it is isolation. It is quarantining. So COVID does that, but what tends to happen is naturally we shrink away because everybody else in our estimation, perception might be doing well, and we are not. So relatively, we don't want to pitch up where everybody seemingly is okay and we're not okay. So when we're not okay and everybody else is okay, we isolate ourselves. And quite simply, not to quit. Not to quit. So you've got purpose, you've got calling. Keep going. Keep going. Dig beyond the 3 feet and discover the gold. And then just lastly, that story about Ruffalo, I mean, Gruffalo, sorry. I call it, in my head, I hear Ruffalo, but Gruffalo. Being audacious in your expectations is what I hear when Ed shares the story about this mouse. And not looking at the elephant in the room, but digging within, understanding what sits in your hands, man. Your hands are not empty. What's in the cupboard? The story about growing this champion tomatoes. So if there are still no any questions, I'm going to ask Ed a question. Or is Corette, do you want to ask, Corette, before your battery dies? Do you want to ask a question? Yes? No?
Hi, sorry, I've just come back on the phone, so I've just missed that interaction. So I'm good. Oh. I'm good on my phone now. I'm on your phone. So yes.
Oh, wonderful! You're still with us, just differently. Oh, ingenuity, determination to stay connected. Wow.
Now, so what was the question?
No, it was just it's in it. I was just summarizing what Ed was saying, but actually, it's an invitation to engage with Ed, to comment, to ask questions, and to have a conversation that we internalize the learning. The outcome must be not to have learned something, tick the check box and said, it was quite nice, thank you for the invite. No, is walk away tonight with a nugget that you can apply tomorrow morning when you wake up in your business. And so yeah, whatever you heard, let's try and contextualize it. Whatever your situation is about, let's talk. So I was just about to ask my own question. My question when Ed started off about the one of the first lessons that he learned is when he's talking about networking and finding networks where everybody wants to sell, wants something from everybody else. And he found a network where most people were wanting to give, and it was sort of more give and take. And I was intrigued because I thought that's actually quite mythical, Ed. Do these networks actually exist, or are you just telling us another story? How does one find these networks?
There are many of them, and I'm members of at least 3. 2 of them are common interest networks because they are for blind and visually impaired people. So they are specific to an industry. But I know there are a number, for instance, of women's networks, which are mutual support networks for women. The other one that I'm a member of is the Public Speakers Association. And they have several networks within the association, which are there to help. And people are incredibly helpful. So we can go onto a network there and get and say to people, come in, I want to rehearse a speech. Will you come and be an audience for half an hour or so? And yeah, people will be there because it's all reciprocal. So look for common interest. Don't look for people you want to sell to, because You being your worst enemy. If you find a network where you want to sell to everyone, then everybody in that network is trying to sell. So find networks where you can share, and you'll find everybody else wants to share. So look for them. They are around, and they're wonderful to be a part of. I'm just knocked out by all of these.